I would like to invite our third presenter, Ms. Regina Birner, who is the chair of the Social Institutional Change in Agriculture Development of the University of Hohenheim in Germany. You have the floor, and you will focus on global governance challenges.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to share some thoughts here on the global governance architecture to enhance food security and nutrition. And in this 10 minutes, I would like to address the following sets of questions. So what do we actually mean by this global governance architecture, or more broadly, global governance, and why do we actually need it? We have seen there's a lot that actually local and national governments can do. Why do we need the international level? And what are the challenges that prevail at the international level, and why do they prevail? And why does the current global governance architecture need reform? That's a proposition. And what are reform options? In a joint paper with Joachim von Braun, we defined global governance as the formal and informal institutions and organizations at the global level that aim to influence the agricultural and the food system, together with the patterns of organizational behavior to which they give rise. And these institutions, formal and informal ones, we could describe as the global governance architecture. But we are very interested in the type of patterns to which they give rise, because that is the issue of performance. Now, do these global organizations, for example, coordinate and collaborate among themselves? Do they actually deliver global public goods? What are their deficiencies? We need to understand the relation between the architecture and the actual performance. Now, what are the types of mechanisms that are available at the global level to influence agriculture and food systems? The most important one is certainly the creation of global organizations, the formulation of global goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, entering into binding agreements, for example, on climate change, we have binding agreements. And we also have voluntary agreements and guidelines in the food sector, for example, on the right to food. These are voluntary guidelines. And we also have private commitments, standards, and labels. For example, a private commitment to have deforestation-free value chains. If we try to put this into a picture, and this, of course, mentions only some of the organizations, because there are hundreds of them, they don't really fit into one picture. But then we have these different groups. So we have this one group here, which are specialized organizations in the area of food, nutrition, and agriculture. The FAO, the CGR, and IFPRI that are organizing this meeting. We have the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition that Stineke is actually leading. We have the Committee on World Food Security and the high-level panel of experts. We have World Food Program, IFAD, and so on. So they are specialized. They emerged after World War II. But then, since then, we have actually the rise of an increasing number of other actors, which are actually not intergovernmental organizations. They are civil society organizations, or they are cross-cutting networks. Scaling Up Nutrition, for example, has a lot of different institutions. And we also see this increasing importance and also increasing concentrations of private sector companies that work at the multinational level, that are multinationals and that have budgets that are far bigger than the budget of any of these UN organizations. And then we have this whole range of institutions that are in related sectors. Health, for example, WHO has a huge impact role for nutrition, or WTO, or UN Environment, and UN Women. And we have these international financial institutions. For example, the agricultural budget of the World Bank is also far larger than the budget of many of these organizations, even though that's, of course, not the only thing they do. And we have this global governance bodies, ECOSOC, for example, that is overseeing these agencies. And we have these ones that are actually informal, like G7 or G20 are basically informal networks, but have, or a food crisis, for example, has shown, may have a far larger impact actually on coordination activities than the formal ones. So why do they actually exist? What is the justification, the underlying justification for this global action? And one can distinguish two types of justifications. And one we could call social goals, humanitarian principles, or the principle of global fairness and equity, which is basically a political commitment and a decision, and where countries may have different opinions, depending on whether they're more on the left or on the political right, how far the international community should actually go. But we have a whole other range, which the economist calls a market failure, a global market failure. And there's actually less contention that from even an economic point of view, there is a need to act. And here we have what can be called the global common pool resources, and climate is actually among them, or biodiversity. We have this global public goods. That term is actually used in two ways. Strictly defined, it would be goods that are characterized by non-excludability and non-rivalry, like the eradication of transboundary diseases, eradication of the rinderpest, for example. The term global public goods often is, however, also used for everything that's in this list as a more generic term. We have externalities with global impact. We have coordination failures. International trade, for example, very much relies on international standards and agreements. Or we have this point here, an increasing concentration of market power of multinational companies would then also require global action. Now, what are the indications that this whole list, what we could call the global agenda, that is delivered with, let's say, mixed results? There's always a question, is the glass actually half empty or half full? Because what we have in these different areas, we see some progress, but certainly the progress is not enough. Yeah, for natural resource management, we do have international agreement, for example, on biodiversity, but we know degradation continues at alarming rates. Paris Agreement on climate change was a milestone, but countries may be leaving. Trade regimes, there was a lot of progress on monitoring of global food reserves, for example, with AMIS, with the Agricultural Market Information System after the food price crisis of 2008, but not really any progress on World Trade Organization, rising protectionism. If we look at the issue of competition policy and standards for foreign direct investments, we see increasing concentration of the agro-industry, and standards for FDI have been developed by Committee on World Food Security, but remain entirely voluntary. If we look at international research and innovation in food and agriculture, a major global public good to be delivered by the CGR, we saw increase in funding after the food price crisis of 2008, but what I would see a rather problematic turn of turning the CGIAR into a development agency rather than a research organization. Responding to food and nutrition, there was really major issues in responding to the food price crisis of 2008. And the question is the world actually now better prepared for such crisis? And we also have this mixed progress, one could say, on transboundary food safety issues. Now, why do these problems actually exist? What are the underlying causes? And of course, a big underlying cause is a problem of collective action. And this is only national politics and national governance that can actually resolve this, because we don't have any world government. So that's actually at the heart of all these problems. We have coordination challenges because we have an increasing range of actors and we have this overlapping sectors. And quite often, lack of coordination at the international level is reflected in overlaps at the country level. So many African countries, for example, develop a strategy for agricultural development, which is promoted by FAO, and they have an agricultural sector investment plan. Then they have a food security strategy with big overlaps to the agricultural strategy, which has their own set of institutions surrounding it. And then they have a nutrition strategy, which again has a lot of overlaps with the other strategies. And that reflects lack of coordination at the international level, because it's actually international institutions that are promoting these overlapping agendas at the national level. And this is just one example that coordination is really lacking. Then we have, just like national bureaucracies, international bureaucracies face the very same problems of bureaucratic inefficiencies, hierarchies, also what is called the mission creep, that they actually always try to expand what they are doing. What we also observe is what I would call a global ideological divide on the future of agri-food systems. Those who have actually participated in the IASTD, in the International Assessment of Knowledge for Development, they actually have seen that. Yeah, and I would say the two poles are, on the one hand, one could call some kind of eco-romanticism on the one hand, and a rather naive faith in technology and markets on the other hand, and in between there is often no consensus. But we also have seen limits to regulating increasing private market power. And now I'm out of time, so I have to speed up a little bit. And also lack of speed in adjusting to new technological developments. What are, for example, ethical issues regarding the invention of CRISPR-Cas in agriculture, or the digital revolution? Are the international organization actually debating data governance? So what are possible reform options? Now this is just suggestions. So do we need a global platform for food, nutrition, and agriculture that goes beyond what the Committee on World Food Security is currently achieving? For example, in the sense that it could be truly independent. What leadership could it have, and how to create legitimacy for civil society and private sector actors? And do we need something that goes beyond the current high-level panel of experts, a science-based assessment mechanism that could really be compared also in its public perception to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that may help to bridge what I would call this ideological divide? So members could be leading scientists from different parts of the world. They could rely on quality-assured literature sources. But the question here again is there really enough political will at the international level to create such institutional change? Or maybe for the discussion, there are ideas for other reform options. Thank you.